Cloudheim has a quite interesting and innovative development context, which seems to be focused on an experience that mixes fast action, dynamic crafting, and a narrative inspired by Norse mythology with a tone of post-Ragnarok reconstruction. The fact that it is a game built with community collaboration and early access demonstrates a flexible and iterative approach, something increasingly common in independent studios that value constant player feedback to shape the game's evolution. What catches my attention, especially, is this combination of genres that seems somewhat improbable at first glance. You have the intensity of fighting games with combos and chaotic physics, alongside base management, simulation, and crafting mechanics, all wrapped up in a setting that refers to a Nordic post-apocalyptic story. This mix promises a depth of gameplay where it's not just about brawling, but strategically thinking about how to assemble equipment, explore, and rebuild. Another aspect that seems very cool to me is the ambition to create a vibrant and interactive world where even the environment can be used to defeat enemies. Imagine knocking down pillars or using tornadoes to control the battle arena. This not only brings freshness to the combat, but also a sense of unpredictability and creativity that can keep players engaged in trying different tactics, which is rare to see in games of this style. Furthermore, the development by the Noodle Cat Studio, formed by veterans from major companies like Epic Games, BioWare, and Electronic Arts, gives me confidence in the technical and artistic potential of the title. They seem to be using modern technology and scientific processes to balance and adjust the gameplay, which suggests a special care to prevent the experience from becoming frustrating or repetitive, especially in the crafting and evolution parts. The concept of the Odin shell, this mobile and customizable base that serves as a central point and means of transportation across Cloudheim's fragmented world, is also a point that I really like. It gives a touch of a living, constantly transforming world, unlike the fixed base scheme we see in many games. This greatly expands the feeling of exploration and progression. Cloudheim has everything to be a unique experience, mixing the tradition of mythologies with modern and bold mechanics. The indie approach, with a strong team of veterans, leaves me with good expectations, even with some natural uncertainties about this ambitious mix. The story of Cloudheim is one of those that immediately captivates with the grandeur of the setting. Ragnarok has already happened, the world is fragmented, and you, along with your friends, are chosen by the gods to reconstruct harmony in a devastated realm. What caught my attention in the demo was precisely this epic and melancholic tone, as if you were truly part of a new era, still full of mystery and possibilities, but also carrying the weight of a violent and chaotic past. The starting point is quite engaging. You don't begin as an invincible hero, but as someone with a mysterious destiny, called by Odin Shell, a giant celestial turtle that serves as your base and refuge in the sky. It is there that you will rebuild your space, your arsenal, and your strength, which creates a very striking sense of belonging and progression right from the first few minutes. It seems like the game wants to make you feel that every step taken outside the Odin shell is a direct contribution to this new history. The references to Norse mythology are very present, but they don't strictly adhere to traditional myths. Cloudheim seems to want to create a new mythology, where you are an active participant in the resurrection of forgotten gods and the restoration of a world in ruins. This allows for a lot of drama, discoveries, and, at the same time, a feeling of hope, as if everything you do has consequences for the future of this new realm. In the demo, I felt that the initial missions have this collective reconstruction atmosphere, where even conflicts between tribes are resolved by your actions, reinforcing the idea that your team is the center of the world's transformation. This strongly reminds me of that legendary hero feeling, but in a more collaborative way, as if each player were a small Odin helping to shape the destiny of others. Another thing I really liked was the visual atmosphere. Everything has vibrant colors and an air of fantasy, but at the same time, there are details that allude to despair and loss. This creates an interesting contrast. The world is beautiful, but also fragile and full of corruption, so your journey is one of restoration, not just physical, but also emotional and spiritual. This makes the plot very rich and potentially very engaging. Of course, Based only on what has been shown so far, it's impossible to say whether the story will maintain this level of depth or fall into predictable formulas, but the foundation is solid. The feeling I had was of being in a reimagined Norse tale, where you and your friends are the protagonists of a new era, carrying the weight and hope of rebuilding everything that was destroyed. Cloudheim delivers a narrative that mixes grandeur, mythology, and a personal touch of reconstruction and hope. The demo experience made me curious to know more about the forgotten gods, about the destiny of the Odin shell, and about how each choice will impact this world in reconstruction. Apparently, it will be an adventure where being a hero is as much about combat as it is about rescuing something greater, the very soul of the world. The gameplay, as far as I could tell from the demo, is that mix of a very good idea with an execution that is still a bit loose but fun nonetheless. It's a game that clearly wants you to feel like you're in a crazy cooperative hack and slash with aerial combos, exaggerated physics, and a lot going on at once. If you like a system that lets you play with the scenario and abuse juggling enemies, the foundation here is very promising. Combat is by far the focus of the experience. Everything revolves around launching enemies into the air, keeping them flying with combos, and then throwing them onto the ground or into objects in the scenario to extract extra damage. The feeling of hitting is good, the impacts have weight, and when you start getting the hang of combining skills from different classes, it gets very satisfying. The downside is that sometimes the characters seem a little too floaty, so there are moments when you lose track of where you are in space amidst the blows. Something I really liked is how the game tries to integrate physics into the gameplay, knocking down pillars onto monsters, kicking explosive barrels, pulling enemies into tornadoes, or using the scenario as a damage tool makes every fight look different. When in a group, this gets even cooler because that improvised synergy starts happening. One lifts, another pulls, another explodes. Is it chaotic? Very. But that's precisely where the fun lies. But this chaos sometimes comes at a cost in visual clarity and understanding of what is happening. The real-time crafting part is another thing that catches the eye. Instead of being stuck in a menu, you literally interact with stations in the Odin shell, toss materials, forge weapons, and abilities in a very visual way, almost like its own mini-game. This fits well with the game's pace because it doesn't break the flow of action as much, and it still gives that sense of authorship over the equipment you take into battle. For those who like to experiment with builds, the system seems to have plenty of room for variations. The exploration, for now, is more functional than revolutionary, but it's enjoyable. Triple jump, absence of fall damage, and tiered platform islands make movement agile and make you want to go rummaging everywhere for chests, resources, and dungeons. It has a touch of vertical playground that combines well with the fragmented world in the sky theme, but it still lacks a bit of refinement in path reading and objectives. Sometimes you feel a bit loose without a clear direction. In co-op, the gameplay reaches another level of fun. 4 players sharing weapons, skills, and progress, combining classes to create insane setups, make the game look like an organized party in chaos. Alone, it's still fun, but it's clear that the design was intended for a crowd, so those who plan to play 100% solo might not feel the same brilliance as those who will enter with friends and a microphone on. Overall, the feeling is of a gameplay with the soul of a cooperative fighting game crammed inside an ARPG with crafting and crazy physics. It's very fun when everything works, especially in a group, but there are still rough edges in movement, combat reading, and clarity amidst the chaos. Even so, the demo gives that impression of, okay, this is different and has potential. So if you like action co-op with bold ideas, Cloudheim already delivers a very fun foundation to keep an eye on. Cloudheim's graphics are one of its greatest strengths, at least from what I could see in the demo. The cartoonish aesthetic with vibrant colors and exaggerated proportions really stands out and gives the game a unique visual identity. It seems like they drew a lot of inspiration from Zelda and games like those from Studio Ghibli, but managed to create something of their own, which doesn't fall into direct copying, which I appreciate. The environments of the floating islands are incredibly well crafted. Vertical layers, natural arches, and surreal settings create striking silhouettes and give that feeling of discovery with each new area. It's easy to get lost looking at the waterfalls that disappear into the void and the ruins at impossible angles, all of which is justified by the post-Ragnarok narrative. This surreal and colorful visual helps to immerse the player in this new mythical world, as if you were truly exploring a forgotten realm. The characters also draw attention with exaggerated heads and hands, which somewhat harks back to the Fortnite style, but without looking generic. Each one has their own look, which facilitates identification in co-op and makes the gameplay more fun, especially when you see everyone jumping and fighting with this somewhat silly but very personal air. The problem is that in combat, all this can become a bit chaotic. Explosions, particles, and luminous effects cover the screen, especially when multiple players use abilities simultaneously. It's beautiful, but it can be difficult to keep track of the action when there is too much going on, especially in crowded battles. I feel the lack of a little more balance between visual impact and gameplay clarity sometimes. The visual exaggeration hinders more than it helps. The enemy models, in turn, are quite varied, ranging from plant creatures to stone golems, all with striking features and saturated colors. The boss animations have personality and rhythm, but those of the common enemies are still a bit stiff, as if they still need adjustments to gain fluidity. The interface visuals are still raw, especially in the demo, with generic fonts and icons, which clashes with the rest of the game. It's noticeable that the art of the world and the characters is well done, but the menu and UI part seems only functional, without a striking visual identity. I hope this evolves by the launch, as this part also significantly influences the overall experience. Overall, Cloudheim has a captivating look, mixing familiar inspirations with original touches and a very lively atmosphere. The highlights are the scenarios and characters, but the graphic experience can still be polished, especially during combat and in the interfaces. Even so, it's a game that won me over with its visual beauty and creativity, and you can see that it has a lot of potential to grow even more. Cloudheim's performance in the demo and open tests gives that feeling of early access at its core. It's possible to have fun, but it's clear that the game is still in a phase of optimization far from ideal. In quieter moments, exploring islands or fighting few enemies, the frame rate remains relatively stable and acceptable, especially on mid-range hardware, which leaves a good first impression. However, that initial confidence quickly fades when the screen starts filling up with effects and enemies. The point where performance suffers the most is precisely where the game should shine. Chaotic battles with multiple players, particles everywhere, and crazy physics. In boss situations with 4 players and a lot of things exploding, the frames drop noticeably, going from around 50-70 frames per second to the 35-45 frames per second range on setups with an RTX 3070 and Ryzen 5, which already indicates that there is a lot of optimization ahead. It doesn't make the game unplayable, but you clearly feel that drag in the most intense battles. One thing that personally bothers me more than the drop in FPS itself is the inconsistency. There is that occasional micro stutter, small freezes when too much happens at the same time, or when changing areas. In a game that relies on fast combat, crazy physics, and co-op with tight timing, any hiccup breaks the rhythm and takes away some of the satisfaction of landing combos or using the environment to your advantage. It gives the feeling that the game engine is always pushed to its limit. On the other hand, something that is positively surprising is the general stability. There aren't many reports of constant crashes in the demo, which is already a good sign for this stage of development. The online co-op part also seems to work solidly, with friends being able to enter and leave the session without destroying progress or causing major lag issues. This is important, because a stable FPS is useless if the connection and session flow keep breaking the experience. Load times between islands are still a weak point. Around 15 to 20 seconds to load areas that aren't even that gigantic gives the impression that there is room for improvement in content streaming and asset management. In a game loop that encourages exploring several islands, this accumulated time starts to be tiresome, especially when you just want to get back quickly to combat or to the Odin shell to deal with crafting and upgrades. You can also feel that much of the performance burden comes from the exaggerated physics and effects. The quantity of particles, ragdolls, and objects interacting at the same time seems to take a high toll on the CPU and GPU, which explains why even stronger machines cannot keep everything locked at 60 frames per second in more demanding situations. At the same time, this is part of the game's identity, so the studio's challenge will be to optimize without compromising the fun of the visual chaos. Overall, the feeling when playing the demo is of a game with a fun core, but constrained by still inconsistent performance, typical of an ambitious early access. You can clearly see the potential, especially in co-op, but those who are more sensitive to FPS drops and stutters will probably prefer to wait for some optimization updates before diving in completely. If the studio manages to address these bottlenecks, Cloudheim has everything to become much smoother and more enjoyable to play, without losing the madness that makes it interesting. Cloudheim, from what could be felt in the demo, is that typical early access game that has a fun core, but is still clearly raw in several aspects. So, whether it's worth buying at launch depends heavily on your player profile and your tolerance for a game under construction. The foundation is there. Chaotic combat, cool co-op, interesting visual crafting, and a world with its own identity, but still with fluctuating performance, bugs, and systems that seem not to have reached their final form. If you like to get in early on early access games, give feedback, watch the game evolve closely, and don't mind dealing with stutter, FPS drops, and balancing adjustments. Cloudheim is an interesting candidate to pick up at launch. The feeling it gives is of an ambitious project with a lot of room to grow and which already delivers a minimally fun gameplay loop, especially in co-op. In this scenario, buying at launch is almost like joining the dev on this journey. Now, if you are the type who gets easily annoyed by instability, occasional bugs, and systems that are still somewhat repetitive, the answer leans more towards better wait. The demo itself and initial analyses make it clear that the game still suffers from moments of performance, mess, and somewhat raw execution of some ideas, even if the potential is obvious. For this profile, it makes more sense to wait a few months, check out patches, content increases, and community feedback before investing. Regarding the target audience, Cloudheim is highly recommended for those who like online co-op focused on action and controlled chaos. If you enjoy playing with 2-3 friends, testing different builds, combining skills, and laughing at the chaos that happens on the screen when everything explodes at once, this is the type of game that fits well in groups that want something light, but with enough depth to repeat sessions. Those who come from experiences like Deep Rock Galactic, Valheim, or co-op games with crafting and combat will feel at home. It is also a game recommended for those who like to experience evolving systems, visual crafting, mobile-based Odin shell, floating shop, and shared progression among the group form a package that should become more interesting over time. For those who like to test builds, explore synergies, and see the game's meta being born along with the community, getting in early can be quite satisfying. This type of player sees the rough state and already imagines what it can turn into later. On the other hand, if you are looking for a super polished campaign, a tightly closed narrative, and a more cinematic single-player experience, Cloudheim doesn't seem to be that game, at least for now. It is much more about systems, cooperation, and repeating runs on islands and dungeons than about an ultra-guided story and AAA finishing. So, for this type of player, the recommendation would be to wait for the game to mature, gain more story content, and more solid reviews of the complete version. Summarizing very directly, for those who like co-op, accept the stumbles of early access well, and enjoy seeing a game grow alongside the community, it makes sense to consider buying at launch, especially if it comes with a lower price. For those who prioritize polish, stability, and complete content, the best thing is to hold on to their money, follow updates, and perhaps jump in when Cloudheim has a few patches and major updates ahead of what the demo shows today.
is Nasher. Release him, and he will assist you faithfully, in his own unique way.